What's up, everybody? This is Harley, and welcome to the first 2025 episode of the Unapologetically Spicy podcast, the Blackity podcast about the layered, nuanced, and unapologetically real experiences of life as a neurodivergent Black woman. Before we get into it, I want to offer you a trigger warning for today's episode. We get really raw here, so this episode will include discussions of emotional abuse and pregnancy loss. If you've been rocking with Unapologetically Spicy since I started this a year ago, you know I only disappear when life gets extra, well, lifey. So be prepared. This episode may be a long one, kind of like a check in, a vent session, a healing circle, and a history lesson, all in one. Let's start with something that's been sitting heavy on my spirit: narcissistic parents. If you listen to previous episodes, you already know my relationship with my mother is, well, it's layered, complicated, painful. I've talked about narcissistic parents before, but the thing about that kind of trauma is it doesn't just stay neatly tucked away. It shows up in your body, your boundaries, your relationships. It lingers in the silences between texts, in the guilt after standing up for yourself, and in the ache that hits when you realize they're never going to be who you needed them to be. Lately, I've been sitting with that more than usual, especially after realizing just how much of my story was never really mine to begin with. It was hers. My mother's narrative, my mother's control, my mother's comfort. And somewhere along the way, I got written out of my own life. And that realization isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it creeps in over time through small interactions, repeated patterns, and the growing, gnawing feeling in your gut that something isn't right. That feeling becomes impossible to ignore. And for a long time, I tried to convince myself she wasn't a narcissist. Maybe I was just overreacting, being too sensitive, reading too much into things. But I'm still processing the fact that she agreed to be a reference for my ex fiance's job. The same man who hurt me, who manipulated me, who violated my trust in the most intimate ways. She knew. She knew. And still chose to co sign him. That betrayal hit different. It was like the final confirmation that her loyalty has never truly been with me. I remember the way my stomach dropped when I found out. It was like all the air left the room. She didn't just dismiss my pain, she aligned herself with it. And it's wild because in that moment, all the childhood confusion came rushing back. The sense of being disposable, of being the scapegoat, of being the emotional dumping ground for someone who demanded loyalty but never offered protection. But the gut punch realization that she didn't like the guy I was dating, that was a turning point. And it wasn't even that she outright said she didn't like him. It was her tone, the coldness, the judgment, the absence of warmth, the passive aggressive digs, the refusal to see me happy unless it was on her terms. See, it wasn't about concern. It wasn't rooted in love. It was control. It was manipulation. It was judgment disguised as advice. And suddenly, so much clicked into place. Like how she would only show affection when it benefited her image, or how she constantly made me feel like I was too much and not enough at the same time. I started watching videos by Jerry Wise. He's a former pastor and family systems coach who specializes in narcissistic family dynamics. If you haven't heard of him, please look him up on YouTube. He's like a translator for people trying to make sense of the mess that narcissists leave behind. He helped me name what I've been experiencing my whole life. In some of his videos, He breaks down the long term impact of narcissistic parenting, especially on us adult children. One of the things he emphasizes is this idea of self differentiation, which basically means becoming your own person, not the role you were forced into, not the version of you that had to walk on eggshells to keep the peace. As adult children, we often carry this deeply embedded guilt for setting boundaries or even just existing outside of our parents' control. And if you're anything like me, you've probably wrestled with thoughts like, am I being too harsh? Or maybe it really is my fault. But that's the conditioning. That's the manipulation that started before we even knew what the word manipulation meant. Jerry Wise talks about narcissistic parents, or how narcissistic parents blur emotional boundaries and even make you feel responsible for their moods, their happiness, their lives. We learn to shapeshift, to shrink ourselves, to avoid rocking the boat. And even when we leave the house, that guilt doesn't leave us. And when you finally try to detach, they interpret it as a betrayal, not growth. Setting boundaries with a narcissistic parent feels like committing a crime, not because it's wrong, but because we were raised to believe that our autonomy was a threat, that our independence was betrayal. And yet, healing means learning to choose ourselves anyway. I've had to remind myself over and over that healing isn't rebellion. It's taking back the version of yourself that never got to fully exist in the first place. And that's a journey I'm still on. Some days I feel powerful, like I'm finally stepping into who I've always been underneath the conditioning. Other days, I feel like I'm grieving someone who never really existed, the idea of a mom I should have had. But both of those feelings are real. Both are part of the process. I moved out of my mother's house once again a month ago. I moved out because I had to, not just for space, but for survival. The emotional tension, the gaslighting, the way everything became my fault, even things that had nothing to do with me. It was suffocating. I remember feeling guilty for wanting peace, like I was abandoning her instead of saving myself. That's how deep the manipulation runs. I needed peace. I needed my own rhythm, my own environment, free from someone constantly policing my tone, my decisions, my emotions. It wasn't an easy decision. It was layered in grief and guilt and that deep rooted feeling that I was abandoning someone I was supposed to care for. But I had to choose me. I've seen the impact in my current relationships too. The way I sometimes brace myself for abandonment because that's what love used to feel like: conditional, performative, fleeting. How I struggle to let people love me without feeling like I owe them something. How I brace for backlash every time I set a boundary. How I over explain myself to avoid being misunderstood. Because that's what I had to do growing up just to feel safe. I'm learning now that I don't owe anyone my pain in exchange for love, that I'm allowed to take up space, to say no, to not be on all the time. And the patterns I learned at home showed up in who I chose to love, like my ex fiance. Talking about my ex fiance is also complicated, not because I haven't processed it. I mean, it was a really significant relationship in my life, so I might end up processing and grieving for a long time, especially because a part of me will always love him. But the clarity, that healing, it makes the whole thing even heavier because now I could see all the red flags I danced around, all the boundaries that I softened, all the times I chose empathy over my own well being. We were together for almost 5 years. When we got engaged, I genuinely believed it was the beginning of something beautiful. I poured so much for myself into that relationship. And not just love, labor, emotional labor, mental labor, spiritual labor. I was constantly holding space for his wounds, his moods, his needs, while mine sat quietly in the corner, waiting to be acknowledged. But here's the thing about being in survival mode, it becomes your normal. The anxiety, the second guessing, the walking on eggshells, the building resentment and anger inside, it all gets disguised as quote unquote being a good partner. I was loyal. I was patient. I was ride or die to a fault. And he knew that because my mother told him I was before we moved across the country, before we got engaged. As women, we are constantly told that we're too emotional, too intense, too reactive, too much. And when we try to advocate for ourselves or those around us, we get labeled as aggressive or crazy or unstable. So in that relationship, I overexplained. I softened my voice. I swallowed my truth. I tried to be the cool, calm, collected partner while internally screaming. But no amount of masking or code switching made me safe. Because the moment I stepped out of the role he assigned for me, the supporter, the fixer, the emotional cushion, I became the enemy. And that's when I knew it was never love. It was performance. Real love doesn't make you question your reality. It doesn't punish you for advocating. It doesn't disappear when you have needs. Real love shows up on the hard days. It listens, adjusts, takes accountability. It invites your full self, not just the palatable pieces. And I'll be honest, there are still days where I grieve the version of me who wanted so badly to be chosen, who stayed, who tried. And I now know he weaponized my softness. He exploited the very traits that made me a good partner: my compassion, my desire to understand, my capacity to forgive. And he twisted them into tools to keep me small. But the part that still gets me, the part that still lives in the pit of my stomach, is how much I ignored myself to keep that relationship alive. I saw the cracks. I felt the weight. But I kept telling myself, this this is what commitment looks like. Relationships take work. Except it was always my work, my sacrifice, my silence. And let's be real. His behavior went way past emotional immaturity. It was manipulative. It was coercive. At times, it was flat out abusive. There's something especially painful about realizing the person you were supposed to build a life with didn't just fail you, they betrayed you. Not just in the obvious ways, but in the subtle erosion of your self worth, the way they gaslighted your reality, the way they made you question your gut, your feelings, your memory. One of the hardest parts of leaving my ex wasn't just the breakup itself, it was the unraveling, the quiet moments, the painful moments, where I had to sit with all the ways I betrayed myself to stay. And if we're being real, some of the most damaging moments in that relationship weren't just the blow ups, they were the performances, the I love yous that came after he saw me shut down, the apologies with no change, the way he'd suddenly become affectionate or hyper attentive right after I expressed needing space or support. It was textbook: love bomb, neglect, manipulation, repeat. At the time, I told myself, he's trying, he's just wounded. I gave him the benefit of every doubt. Let my empathy sit in the driver's seat while my intuition screamed from the trunk. And I get it. When you're someone who feels deeply, who understands people on an emotional level, you want to believe love can heal. You want to believe that if you just love someone enough, they'll rise into the version of themselves you see in your head. But that's not love. That's emotional martyrdom. And I lived there for too long. And I lost myself trying to love him. I confused performative affection for real love. He knew how to show up when people were watching. But in the quiet moments, when it was just us, the empathy was selective, conditional. I especially saw this when it came to trying to co parent with him. I tried. God, I tried. I showed up with patience, with compassion, or at least I did my best to. I tried to advocate for his child, his son, especially when I noticed the signs of neurodivergence. I saw myself in that little boy. I recognized the overstimulation, the emotional overwhelm, the shutdowns. And when I tried to gently bring it up, he dismissed it, shut it down. He didn't want to hear it. Even when I suggested new approaches to discipline, not out of judgment, but from a place of worry and concern over a little biracial boy, he'd shut me down. I want to be real here. Some of the ideas I had about discipline back then, they weren't perfect. They were rooted in the way that I was raised, in control, in fear, in trying to do it right because I never had a safe blueprint to follow. I was still parenting from an unhealed place. But even in that messiness, I was trying. I was willing to learn. I was open to feedback. I wanted to do right by that child. I wanted him to feel safe and seen. But maybe acknowledging it would have meant admitting that his child needed something different, something he didn't want to provide, maybe something he didn't think he could provide. And instead of curiosity or openness, I was met with anger, defensiveness, control. It was another reminder that his ego always came before empathy, that he wasn't interested in being a better father or partner. He was interested in looking like one. And what broke my heart the most wasn't just that he wouldn't listen, it was that his son was the one who suffered for it. A child who needed emotional safety, consistency, and understanding was being raised in a home where performance and punishment took priority over presence. And here I was, trying to build bridges with broken tools, trying to advocate for a child who wasn't mine, with a partner who refused to acknowledge that his son's needs deserved more than the bare minimum. And that's the thing about narcissistic men in relationships. They don't want intimacy, they want supply. They want admiration, obedience, control. They want someone to mirror back the version of themselves they curated, someone to clap when they almost show up, instead of being held accountable when they don't. I let my empathy override my better judgment. I stayed because I thought I could help. I thought my love could soften his rough edges and calm his anger. But narcissistic men, or at least men with narcissistic tendencies, know how to weaponize your compassion. They mirror your nurturing energy until you're so wrapped up in their version of reality that you start to lose your own. It took everything falling apart for me to finally choose me. And don't get it twisted. I still grieve that version of me, the one who believed love had to hurt, the one who mistook trauma bonding for intimacy, the one who thought being chosen meant being safe. One of the hardest parts to unpack has been the grief. A grief that doesn't just whisper, but screams. It's not just the sadness of what happened, it's the rage at what didn't, what should have, what you needed. Grief doesn't just sit in the what could have been, it lives in the cracks of all the moments where you needed care and got silence, needed presence and got performance, needed partnership and got dropped in front of a clinic with no one to hold your hand but a stranger. I lost two pregnancies while I was with him. Two. And each time, it wasn't just the physical pain, it was the weight of knowing that I was making these decisions alone, even though I was in a relationship. The first was supposed to be an abortion, but it turned into a miscarriage. I remember lying in bed crying, in pain, with Law and Order SVU playing in the background. He sat with me for 15 minutes during his lunch break and then left. That moment still haunts me. Not just because of what I went through, but because of how alone I felt while going through it. The second time, when I told him I was pregnant, he didn't react. No excitement, no fear, just, it's your body, your choice. I'll support whatever you decide. And sure, on paper, that might sound supportive, pro choice, respectful. But in reality, it felt like abandonment, like emotional shrugging, like being handed the full weight of a decision that should have been shared, should have been talked about, should have been talked through, cried over, sat with. It felt like apathy dressed up as support. And when I decided to have the abortion, he dropped me off at Planned Parenthood, told me to call him when it was over, and left. I had to go inside alone. I had to sit in that waiting room alone, fill out forms alone, grieve alone. I held a stranger's hand while they performed the abortion. A stranger. Not the man I was building a life with. Not the father of the child I was letting go of. Not the man I love. And when I brought it up later, when I told him how hurt I was, how abandoned I felt, he said, I was just waiting to see how you'd react. That he didn't come in because he wasn't sure if he was allowed to. And sure, okay, I'll give him that. It was post COVID, there were still restrictions in place. And at the time, he apologized. But when I look back now, I wonder if he meant it. And I don't know if he meant it. Because when someone wants to be there, they ask, they push, they advocate to show up for you, they try. And what burns is that I didn't choose abortion lightly. I chose it because I knew deep down we weren't ready. His son was already struggling so much. The environment was already unstable. Adding another child into that mix would have been irresponsible, cruel even. I made that choice from a place of love, and I paid for it with silence, with pain, with a partner who didn't even hold my hand. So, yeah, there's grief, there's rage, not just at him, but at the version of me who thought that this was the best that I could do, who thought she was being strong for carrying all of it, who mistook emotional neglect for emotional maturity. I'm still angry for her, and I love her because she was doing her damn best. She was trying to build something real in a house made of smoke and mirrors. A year ago, we went on what I now call our Hail Mary family trip. I had begged him to take us somewhere that wasn't his hometown or his home state out in the Midwest, because honestly, that's where almost all of our trips have been. I can count on one hand the trips that I can remember that weren't in his home states. We chose Myrtle Beach. I got sick, some sinus infection or something, and I still pushed through. Even through the fatigue and irritation, I remember feeling the emotional weight more than anything, the disconnection, the sense that I was dragging myself toward a version of love that simply didn't exist anymore. We went to a pirate show, loud cannons, flashing lights, chaotic energy everywhere. And while it might have been fun for some folks, for me, it was overwhelming. The kind of sensory overload that makes your skin crawl and your brain freeze. I felt the panic rising in my chest like a wave I couldn't stop. And all I wanted was to leave, to breathe, to escape. But instead of reading the room or me, my ex insisted we stop and I take a photo with his son. Like everything I was feeling didn't matter. Like I was just a prop in a family portrait he could share later. I held it together until we pulled up to the hotel, and then I couldn't anymore. I asked him to let me out of the car right in front of the hotel, and I ran. I ran to the pool area and I had a full meltdown, completely uncontained. I sobbed. I unraveled. I sat with all the unspoken pain I had been holding in for who knows how long. I called my best friend. Back then, he saw me. He didn't question my feelings or try to fix them. He listened. He helped me calm down. He reminded me I wasn't crazy for being overwhelmed in a space that wasn't built for me. In that moment, I realized that this was what safety could feel like. Someone reaching for me with love, not shame. It's wild reflecting on that now because so much has changed since that trip. But what hasn't changed is how much I needed to be seen, not tolerated, not managed, seen. The relationship I'm in now is far from perfect. We've had our ups and downs, especially recently, especially with my mom, the way she reacted to him and how he reacted to that. We've navigated some really tender terrain together. There were moments I almost ran back to my ex, not because I wanted him back, but because the familiarity felt easier than the unknown. But he stayed. My partner, he stayed. He stayed while I was deep in my trauma, combing through every old photo, text, memory from my 5 year relationship with my ex. He stayed when I couldn't sleep, when I cried, when I questioned myself 1,000 times. He was there when I had surgery and didn't know how my body would recover. He was there through the complications, the fear, the quiet days where I just needed to be held. He was there when I lost my job, when I spiraled into anxiety, trying to piece together a new version of my life. When the world felt like it was falling apart, he helped me pick it up, one piece at a time. I often ask myself what being with someone who sees you means, because people aren't just trophies or things to be conquered. Part of being with someone who sees you isn't just about the big sweeping gestures, because if you're into that, then that needs to be acknowledged. But it's in the way that they remember your triggers, the way they pause before reacting, the way they show up over and over, even when you're not at your best, especially when you're not at your best. And honestly, sometimes I think about what it would be like to talk to my ex now, interview him on this podcast for funsies. Not necessarily to hash things out or point fingers, but to ask him what he thought love meant, to understand what he thought we were building. Not because I want him back, he missed the opportunity to come back long ago, but because healing sometimes means closing the loop, not for them, but for you. But then again, closure isn't always about getting answers. Sometimes it's about making peace with the fact that some people will never meet you where you are. Not because you weren't worth it, but because they weren't capable. And even then, I can hold space for both the heartbreak and the healing, the mistakes and the growth, the grief and the gift of finally being free. And while that trip reminded me of how unseen I felt in that relationship, this new chapter of my life has brought spaces where I finally feel held. Surprisingly, one of those spaces is my job. When I started this role, I didn't expect it to hold so much space for me to grow, not just professionally, but emotionally, spiritually, and personally. I've worked jobs where I felt invisible, where my joy was too much. My passion was inconvenient, and my softness was mistaken for weakness. Jobs where I was constantly in survival mode, masking just to get through the day. But this job, it's different. I used to think work was just where I survived, but now it's a space where I bloom. And baby, I'm blooming loud. People see me here. They celebrate my energy, they lean into my light, and they make room for all the parts of me, especially the ones I used to hide. I'm not just tolerated, I'm appreciated, and not in a performative checkbox kind of way, but in a genuine, we're so glad you're here kind of way. And let me tell you, that hits so different when you spent so much time in environments that made you question your worth. It's wild how, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm constantly bracing for rejection. I'm not walking on eggshells, trying to manage perceptions or make myself smaller to fit. I'm showing up full voice, full heart, full self, and I'm being met with love. And you know what that's done? It's watered my self-love's love in ways that I didn't even realize were still dry. Every time someone compliments my energy, thanks me for my kindness, or tells me how much they appreciate working with me, it's like another little reminder. You're not too much. You're exactly enough. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that my job is perfect or that work is some magical healing fairyland. It still comes with its challenges, its stress, its moments where I have to pause and breathe through it. But what makes this place special is that I don't have to abandon myself to succeed here. I don't have to shrink. I can grow. It turns out healing doesn't just happen in therapy or journals. It can happen over coffee breaks, team huddles, and belly laughs in the break room. And maybe that's what healing looks like in this chapter. Being in a space that reflects back the love and value I'm learning to give myself. A space where I could be soft and powerful, silly and serious, joyful and grounded. A space that says, you belong here, and actually means it. This job has reminded me that I am worthy of being loved for who I am, not just what I produce or how well I perform. And honestly, that kind of love from others and from myself, it's revolutionary. Now, let's talk about what it means to be part of the 92%. That is, the 92% of Black women who didn't vote for Trump and who are once again trying to find a way to breathe in a country that feels like it keeps tightening its grip. We're back here again, and it's more than just politics, it's personal. Because every time a system shifts in favor of someone who openly disregards our humanity, it's not just about policy. It's about the very real ripple effects on our bodies, our families, and our futures. As a Black woman, a neurospicy Black woman at that, it's not hard to feel like I'm constantly having to fight for space in a world that is hell bent on shrinking me. The mental gymnastics it takes to just exist can be overwhelming. There's this constant weight of being too loud, too sensitive, too emotional, too aware. It's exhausting. And what's been really messing with my spirit lately is seeing people celebrate his return. Watching folks post misinformation like these smug, surface level takes about tariffs, like there's some economic flex. Like they don't realize, or maybe they just don't care, that tariffs hit us, the people. Not the corporations, not the billionaires, but everyday folks, regular ass people who are already struggling will be the ones paying more for groceries, gas, basic necessities. And yet they cheer him on like he's about to hand them some miracle wrapped in a red hat. It's the cognitive dissonance for me. Watching people, especially people who will be directly harmed by his policies, support him with such misplaced loyalty feels like a gut punch. It's infuriating. It's heartbreaking. It's giving willful ignorance. And I don't say that with malice. I say it from a place of exhaustion because many of us have been screaming the truth for years now, not because we enjoy the sound of our own voices, but because the stakes are high. Because silence is complicity. Reproductive rights being stripped away. Education whitewashed and sanitized. DEI being demonized by like equity and inclusion are somehow a threat. And as someone in HR who lives this work every day, I feel like I'm constantly walking a tightrope between being effective and being erased. This country is so good at pretending. Pretending racism is over. Pretending sexism is exaggerated. Pretending neurodivergence is just a quirky inconvenience and not something we navigate in every room, every job, every relationship. But even in this storm of gaslighting and grief, we're still expected to keep it cute and keep it pushing. But I'm done with the cute. I'm done pretending. Because while I'm scared, I'm also clear. I'm clear that real love means accountability, that empathy is not infinite when it comes at the cost of your sanity, that survival is not enough. We deserve to thrive. And listen, if you're feeling overwhelmed right now, you are not alone. If your nervous system is on edge, if your mind is racing, if your heart is heavy, you are not imagining it. This moment is heavy. This life is heavy. This country can be hostile. And for those of us who live at the intersections, Black, neurodivergent, femme, queer, we feel every single crack in the system. So I want to say this directly to my neuro spicy Black women. You are not obligated to protest in the streets just to prove that you care. You are not required to burn yourself out to show your solidarity. Your safety matters. Your peace matters. Your health, mental, emotional, physical, it matters. Rest is resistance. Silence, when chosen for your healing, is a revolution. We've inherited a legacy of being the backbone, the caregivers, the warriors, the ones who show up even when no one else does. For generations, Black women have been screaming at the top of their lungs, fighting for change that benefits everyone, not just us. And what have we gotten in return? Often, silence, dismissal, gaslighting, sometimes even violence. So if you need to sit this one out, sit it out. If your body says no more, listen. You are not less powerful for protecting yourself. You are not less radical for choosing rest, joy, or stillness. You are not less of a fighter for opting to survive first. Because you, my love, you are the revolution. Your voice, your care, your boundary, your healing. It's all part of the movement. And don't you dare let anyone else, especially in this chaotic political machine, convince you otherwise. This episode isn't just a vent or a life update. It's part of my reclamation. So to you, I say thank you. Thank you for holding space for me, for listening, for letting me be messy and real and raw. Now I'm going to turn it to you. What version of yourself are you still grieving? Where have you been performing love instead of receiving it? And if this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it. Make sure you drop the Unapologetically Spicy podcast a follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast fix. Follow the podcast on Instagram at Unapologetically Spicy Pod or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Unapollo Spicy Pod. Want to talk about the podcast online? Use hashtag Unapologetically Spicy Pod to start the conversation. Leave a comment on the show's page on Spotify or leave a review on our official Facebook page. And until next time, lovelies, stay spicy.